Hey there, Banditos. Thank you for joining us for yet another episode this week of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this Friday, February 3rd. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
And today we're bringing you an interview with Greg Goldstein. Now, Greg is not your typical Dollar Bin Bandits guest. He's not an artist. He's not a writer. However, he is a veteran of the publishing and media world. He was the COO of IDW Publishing, which I am an absolute huge fan of. They have some of the best work going on right now. They own some great titles. You may be familiar with them, you newer comic book collectors. Not Warren, though. We're talking Ninja Turtles, The Last Ronin, Transformers, and even Godzilla versus the Power Rangers. You heard me correct. It's actually a really good comic. Alas, as much as I love this publishing company, I could not be on this interview, and it really sucked for me. However, this is an Oren only episode, so hunker down because you're going to hear Oren discuss new comics, which is fun. But in all seriousness, it's a great interview.
Yeah, and also for me, it was so cool because besides comic books, I'm also a big baseball card fan, and he was really at the ground floor when Topps went from baseball cards to try to get into the comic book world itself. Mike Mignola did a lot of wonderful work there on the Dracula books, and so many other talented artists went there too. So that's a publishing company that we haven't really talked about much on Dollar Bin Bandits. So to get some information on that was really, really wonderful. And Greg's just one of the coolest guys I've spoken to. So I think you're going to love this one. Here we go, Greg L. Goldstein. So, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So the question we start off with everyone, how did your journey into comic books begin?
So how many parts do you want to do this podcast over? So 5 or 6 of those?
I'll put on a pot of coffee.
Yeah, there you go. We'll both need it. So real quick, I mean, I think I started the way most people do as a fan. I can basically remember reading some 60s DC comics or having my folks and my aunt help me read them. And I just remember being fascinated by, sort of by comics from the get-go. And, based on my age, all the pop culture was getting very colorful because of the Batman TV show and because of other things that were happening in the 60s. And comics to me were just, they were just like this explosion of color and in some cases story, depending on what you were reading. and I just, I got hooked. And recently I was looking at cover dates of certain comics that I remember. And I must have kind of come in and out a few times where, I buy a bunch of comics for a few months and then maybe, get distracted by school or something else and then go back. And, but by the time probably I was 10 or 11, I was just a hooked collector.
And when did you make the decision that you wanted to be in the industry itself?
So that's a really good question because I've kind of come in and out of the industry in different capacities, just to name drop a little bit here. I grew up with Joey Cavalieri, and Joey and I are from the same hometown, or we both moved to that same hometown about the same time, and we both knew each other from comic book circles. And Joey made the actual active choice to really get into the industry, and he's been in the industry, his whole career, his whole life. Whereas I love the industry, I never quite saw a path. I think particularly since I was a failed artist as a teenager, I struggled. I'd sit at my desk. I can remember doing this, finishing homework and sitting at my desk and struggling to draw like anyone. Of course, I probably picked Kirby and Adams and Frazetta, but I was like, I was trying, and I couldn't quite pull it off. So I think because I was interested in the creative arts and I was interested in visualization, I did a little bit of I had done a little bit of writing, but I never saw myself as a fiction writer. I saw myself more as a in sort of nonfiction, maybe journalism or something like that. So it's a great question because I never actively made that decision. It happened because I kept getting called back to the things that I love. And I was a frequent guest and visitor attendee, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. I was a frequent attendee at the old New York Comic Cons, the old Phil Seuling Second Sunday shows, where I met a lot of professionals, and some of them, looking back, were only a few years older than I was. It was like, all right, here I am, and it was the industry was going through a period in the 70s when it was very open to youth. And if you look at the credits, I mean, you just see all these young creators coming into the business to first supplement the talent that was there, and then ultimately, in many cases, sort of replace people who were either retiring or moving on. And there was an energy that was just between the energy in the books themselves and the energy at these events. I think in the back of my mind, so unconsciously, or subconsciously, I said to myself, "Oh, this is something I want to do." So in some capacity, and I ended up being a very early direct market retailer, because Phil Seuling started the direct market, and I don't know if you've covered that with any of your guests over time, but basically Phil was the one who negotiated deals to be able to buy comics direct from the publishers and then turn around and sell them to retailers. Well, since I was set up almost every month at Phil's show, during that period, he and his people walked around with a little clipboard and said, "Hey, do you want to do this? Here's the deal. You have to buy a minimum of 5 copies of any issue. And it's non-returnable, but you get 60% off," which means, by the way, that the whole dynamics of the market have changed, because obviously Phil was making some money, so the publishers must have been selling at 70% off, or maybe even more, right? So here I'm like, sure, I'll do this. And I had a couple of friends. All we had to do was split our orders, and we'd get mint condition comics instead of pulling them off the newsstands and praying. And so my account number was 006, because he probably had signed up 1 or 2 people prior to the show, and I was the 4th guy on on the clipboard that day. So and by the way, that story annoys Bob Wayne, the former head of marketing and sales at DC, to no end, because he was a very early direct market person as well, but he didn't have that as low a number.
I said you were one of the founding fathers of it all.
Yeah, briefly. So that's right. I probably did it for about 2 to 3 years before it became a hassle between my schoolwork and athletics and social, wanting to go out. I was just it just became one of those things where it's, okay, what am I going to put to the side? So for better or worse, I gave up my first stint in retail. Later on, I came back as a partner in a pretty big comic book store in New York. So I had another pass at it.
Most definitely. And you got to be part of, besides comic fans, I'm a big baseball card fan.
Oh, cool.
Part of Topps getting into the comic market.
That's right.
How did that deal, or how did you, first of all, get involved, and how did that all sort of come together?
So it's funny, I've been meaning to post about this for about 6 weeks now. This is the 30th anniversary of Topps Comics, is actually, as we're speaking. I think Dracula issue number 2 would be out right around now. The movie just actually opened. I saw a number of people posting about sort of 30th anniversary of the Coppola's Dracula, which is the film I'm talking about. It's a great question. Topps had been investigating sort of the comic book market, because the boom had started, I guess there are many booms, but one of the booms had started in the late 80s, early 90s. And, Topps was probably the most successful company in entertainment licensing of any category. Pretty much the big licensors called Topps first before they went to any of their competitors. And so they always had creative people involved, either on staff or freelance, who had their toes or maybe their whole bodies in the comic book market. I mean, Topps's history with trading cards just includes creators like Wally Wood and Jack Davis and Basil Wolverton and Robert Crumb. It's an all-star team of people that, Art Spiegelman, of course, got his career start there. or at least it paid the bills there. Maybe, Arnie was probably doing cartooning before that, but in any event, so they saw what was happening with comics. I do believe Marvel had, and the timeline may have to check me on this, but I think Marvel had just gone public a year or two earlier, and had made the purchase of Skybox Fleer, or maybe had made one of them and added the other one. And Top said, okay, wait a minute, we're ready doing all these deals. We're ready in this business. Can we extend to what we're doing in comics? I knew my boss, my ultimate boss, Ira Friedman. I knew him socially. I was actually publishing a baseball magazine. Ira had launched Topps magazine. There was definitely some confluence. And when he found out that I was a comic book guy, and found out that I was a trading card guy, and I had this, it's sort of like, okay, wait a minute, the stars seem to have lined up a little bit. And so I was not there for all the sort of pre-work on getting the company going. But I got there in time for Dracula, basically. And so, and funny enough, actually, Jim Salicrup, the editor, this might be one of the few times this happened. Jim was hired after they had already started work on the Dracula project, which was kind of funny. So the editor-in-chief came after the first comic, not by much, but by a little bit.
And I would say that Dracula comic, it seems to get rediscovered and rediscovered, because of Mike Mignola's art, and it is amazing, but because the whole series is just so well done. When I talk to friends of mine and stuff, that comic keeps coming up as, you should really check out, if you can find it, that series of comics. I think it's a very underrated book.
It is, and there's a couple of great stories about that series. Number one, I don't know if everyone who is associated with Topps Comics agrees with me, and so let me be clear that this is my opinion only. I think it's the best comic we ever did. I think it's one of the top movie adaptations of all time. Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson's Alien is definitely another one that's up there, and there are a handful of other things that I really like and appreciate. But I agree with you. I think it's a phenomenal book. It's almost like pre-Hellboy in terms of Mike really sort of nailing down that aspect of his style. I mean, obviously, Gotham by Gaslight and some other series, you can see Mike Mignola becoming Mike Mignola. But there's something about Dracula, and particularly since it came right ahead of Hellboy. I don't think he did anything in between. I think it sort of they follow right into each other. I think it's a wonderful series. On a personal level, I chased that series for many, many years, more than a decade, to get the rights to reprint it. And basically, I think it was my endless nagging that we finally found a workaround. I think just literally they gave us the rights at IDW so that Greg would stop talking about it.
Just for that one reason.
And it's a beautiful book. We did a black and white version of it, which I think is terrific. And we did a color, we did the color reprint. People forget the colors were by Mark Chiarello,
right,
who really got a palette that was dead on for the film, just perfect.
And I know you said you weren't there for sort of when it was all coming together, but while you were there, in your mind, how are you thinking, how does Topps break through? And at the time it was a crowded market because you had Valiant, you had Image, Dark Horse was going strong, DC, Marvel, and they had their imprints as well, Impact and
right.
How do you guys, in your mind, how did you break through?
Well, I think on the one hand, the idea was, trading cards were huge at the time too, and the idea that we could kind of figure out a way to package comics with trading cards, which is not it's not necessarily added content, but it added value. If I can make the distinguishing sort of point between those two things, and the novelty of it was just kind of neat. We made some very high quality trading cards that in fact, I think were higher for a short while, maybe a year or two, than what was going on in the sports department. We just said, okay, if this is going to be one of our, and gimmick sometimes is used in kind of negative connotation, so I feel bad using it, but it's going to be one of our gimmicks. Then let's make it, let's make them really good. And again, that's what, Topps had been known for, so that was 92. Topps had been known for 40 years for trading cards. So it made sense to capitalize on that. I think from a content standpoint, we certainly knew we were going to be able to do licensed books, potentially better than some of our competitors. Some of our competitors weren't even interested in licensed books, obviously. That was, so the competition was minimal from that perspective. But we did do, the Jurassic Park adaptation. It's another project at Topps I really love, which, we got Walter to write, and then Gil Kane penciled and George Perez inked. From what I understand, that phone call that the editorial guys made over to George he was like, wait, you want me to ink Gil Kane? When do I start? And it's just sort of like, and I tell everybody this, if you haven't looked at that Topps Jurassic Park comic, look at all the leaves and the trees and that's George Perez. Gil roughed that in a little bit in the pencil. That foliage is George.
You hit it, something right there, is that you guys were getting big names on these books. It wasn't just, I don't want to knock anyone, but it wasn't folks off the street. You were getting industry veterans. You were getting names that people recognize to come in, work on these books, and
right.
Do a knock-up job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That really, that comes from Jim Salicrup's relationship. He had been at Marvel for at least 20 years, maybe just a touch less. But certainly Jim knew a ton of people. Len Brown, our creative director, Ira Friedman, my boss, myself, we all sort of had different relationships. And one of the things that helped us simultaneously, which ultimately became my job at Topps, but was the fact that we were doing some of these really interesting trading card jobs that utilized comic book talent. So Star Wars Galaxy is the most, the most famous of that group, probably. Between the three series, we had over 400 artists contribute to that series. I mean, I could make it much faster if I just tell you the guys that said no, as opposed to the guys that said yes. The project was incredibly time consuming, but I mean, it was worth it. Beyond everyone's expectations. It was just great. And so anyway, we built, I guess where I was going with that was we built some additional relationships based on the fact that, hey, you want to do a trading card for us. And by the way, if you have some time in your schedule the next year, we did launch a comic book company, and we got, and again, and here's another series, and it's not been reprinted, despite the fact that I know Dynamite had the license. I don't know if they still do, but we did a Lansdale and Truman Lone Ranger series, which was just a top talent on a license that people would be like, that's an odd, sort of, it's a Western, but
right.
Joe had a completely different take on it. Truman knocked the art out of the park. I mean, it's another great project from that era. That is another personal favorite of mine.
Right. And also one thing you guys did, because I have the poster right here, so I'm looking at it. The Universal Monsters trading cards.
Oh,
did. And you guys,
we're gonna have to do this in multiple parts. There's a lot to talk about. So do you have an uncut? Are you looking at an uncut sheet of Universal Monsters?
No, I have a store promo poster that they gave out that has the monsters on it, just saying that the cards are coming soon, and it lists some of the artists that were on it. We had Bill Sienkiewicz on last week, and we were talking to him a little bit about.
Okay, well, looking forward to seeing that one.
Yeah, but I mean, again, you guys brought in this talent, and like you said, it was just so smart to say, hey, you want to do these cards? Great. But if you have a little bit of time,
right.
Well.
Yeah, the Universal Monsters, also, that actually had probably been greenlit right ahead of my joining the company. I did work on it a little bit. Terrific talent. Mignola actually did one of the things. My pal Dave Dorman did Incredible Shrinking Man. I remember that. You know, great talent. An artist by the name of Crash, who was the conceptual artist for Jurassic Park, or one of them anyway, did Creature of the Black Lagoon for that series. And it's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous series. Wonderful trading card trivia out of Universal Monsters. Topps was still not entirely thinking about collectors at that time yet. And so I believe all those are 10 card subsets, which drove me straight up a wall because plastic sheets come in 9.
Yeah.
And after that moment, I can't swear what happened after I left, but after that moment, no subset was not a divisible of 3. It was either 3, 6, 9.
Thank you for that.
That was it. We had to lay the law down. It's like, no, this is the way people put them in their sheets. They love them.
I was going to say, because you're either going to say, all right, you know, I have to put one card behind another one, so I can't read the back of that, or you're going to have one card sitting in a sheet by itself, and that's going to drive you crazy because what are you going to fill the rest of those with? So, yeah.
The design is so complicated on the back of those cards and so beautiful. If you look at the technology that took in 1993, the Photoshop rendering that took to execute those design ideas, they would basically set everything up to work overnight. And maybe if you got lucky, you'd come in the morning and maybe the backs would be rendered. They had a tremendous amount of layers. Nowadays, you know, we could replicate that or improve upon it, and it would be, you know, a couple of clicks on our computer. But 30 years ago, they're beautiful cards. They're beautiful cards.
What are your thoughts of the Jack Kirby books that Topps put out and how they were distributed and just how it was all handled?
Another great question. You know, the Kirby event took place in April of 1993, which is considered the beginning of the end of that moment in time, in terms of everybody had big events in April 1993 or big launches, and it kind of crushed the market, and then everybody got a hangover shortly thereafter. You know, I have to work this cliche into at least once, you know, the rest, as they say, is history. But, you know, we did the Kirby verse, a name which I think a couple of us probably simultaneously came up with. But every once in a while, fingers come my direction and go, "Are you the guy that came up with the Kirby verse thing?" You know, look, editorially, the idea was that Jack had a bunch of great ideas that had never come to fruition or had only come to partial fruition. And wouldn't it be fun to kind of take those ideas and sort of expand on them and do some fun things with it? And the event, the Kirby event that I'm talking about in April of 1993, you know, we had some of the Marvel bullpen guys do those comics. So Don Heck did Night Glider, and Severin and Ayers did Bombast, and Steve Ditko did Captain Glory. I mean, we're really kind of like, you know, Jim was from Marvel. Some of our quite a few of our other colleagues were ex-Marvelites. It had a kind of fun idea to it. You know, hindsight being 2020, I think just the market had moved away from those creators and those visions at that moment in time. And it was almost too early to be retro. I think probably 10 years later, if you would announce that event and announce those creators, I think you would have turned the world on its head. You know, just as if just today, you know, today is the right time. If you got back the entire 90s group of creators to do some sort of like one of those Marvel summer crossovers, right? And you got some of the Image guys and, you know, Ron Lim and some of the other folks from that period. I think just because the timing is right for that sort of thing. But a few years earlier or a few years later, maybe not so much. And I think that may have been the challenge with those books, which is why ultimately they really didn't last very long.
Right.
I mean, and there was quite of unpublished material that actually never, to this day, has never seen the light of day.
That's too bad. But I think you're right on the money that it was just the hair off time-wise, because I think folks knew Jack Kirby, but there was so much going on at the time. Because you look at it now and you're saying to yourself, look at the names on these books, like you said before, Dicko, Dick Ayers. I mean, all these wonderful guys. It should have been something that blew people's mind, like, hey, the gang's back together. Look at what's coming out.
Yeah, and I think part of it, I think the other thing was that at the end of the day, the Marvel bullpen is essentially, it's a reality, but it's also a myth, because these were all freelancers working in different places and whatever. And so it's not like you literally have a team of these veteran guys bouncing ideas off of each other. You have editorial talking to them and then talking to the other creators, it's possible. And certainly the three one shots, and then actually the fourth one, which Secret City Saga, which tied it all together. I mean, they all work together, but I think the high concept was greater than the actual than the end result. Despite that, we had tremendous orders on the books.
Yeah.
I mean, we put 1 million Jack Kirby comics into the marketplace in April of 1993. Saying that number makes me kind of went, what? It's true. There's 200,000 each of a little bit over 200,000 of 4 or 5 books. So yeah.
Moving now, you went to Tops's, I guess, competition at the time, Upper Deck, and reading about this, I don't know how you predicted it or saw it, but the gaming boom that was hitting now, and it has been hitting for a while. You were sort of there at the early stages of it. And did you have a feeling that this was going to become as big as it is?
Well, yeah, I'd love to just answer yes and we could move on, but then people would be wondering why we're not doing this from a yacht somewhere out in the middle of the Caribbean. Yeah, that's it. It's the modesty.
You don't like to show off the money.
No, here's the thing. I didn't go directly from Tops to Upper Deck. There were a couple of stops in between, but primarily the important ones, in my opinion, were video games. And basically, so I spent a lot of time in video, and in fact, I was at Activision for a few years at the time that we were really getting the Marvel licenses underway. Something I am willing to be immodest about, because that was a lot of that was on me. But the important thing about those games, comic books had been licensed for games for a really long time, but there were very few really good ones. And the ones that came out of Activision were, the Spider-Man PlayStation 1 game, the Spider-Man movie game for PlayStation 2. These were great games, and the team of which, since I can't program, I have absolutely zero ability to take credit for. But the guys did a tremendous amount of work, hard work on these things, and it proved that if you make a good superhero game, they will come and they will keep on coming. Right. But being in that space just got me thinking about gaming in general. And there were video games, there were board games, and then there were trading card games. Magic had been successful for a few years. Pokemon, blew up pretty quickly. And in my head, I said, well, this seems like if you're into trading cards, you're into comic book art, and you're into video games, this seemed like a really good place to be able to put all that together. So I didn't necessarily see it being as big for as long as it ultimately has been. But clearly it was, clearly that world catches the zeitgeist of a certain demographic and a certain interest, and it just manages to capture a lot of things all at once. And again, because I'm never too far away from comic books per se, at Upper Deck, we had the Versus gaming system, which was launched by my predecessor, Jerry Bennington, as was Yu-Gi-Oh, by the way. But that also meant that we sort of, just like my Topps days, we were going back and getting all these creators to do trading cards. And, you know, as an original art collector, every once in a while I'll see an original from one of those versus cards come up, and I'm like, oh, I remember that one. I remember that one. That's great. And then, again, top talent. The difference is we didn't have a comic book division. Although we did actually make one comic book prior to my getting there. It was based on a TV show called Winx, which was kind of like an adventure story. You know, an adventure story kind of more aimed for girls than boys, but it was nobody had come up with a distribution method, so there were thousands of them in the warehouse when I got there.
I want to step back to what you said before about working with Activision with the Spider-Man game. Was there hesitation on Marvel's part to get into video games? Because I mean, yeah, the 80s Atari's games weren't a ton of fun, but the technology really wasn't there to make them a ton of fun. Were they hesitant, or were they pretty excited to be part of it?
Well, if you look at the timing, Marvel was coming out of bankruptcy, and they were super excited at the money. And I mean, I said it completely non-cynically. I mean, literally, they saw the opportunity. If a video game could be successful, you know, they saw the economic opportunity. This is before we launched the X-Men game. I want to say almost day and date with the first X-Men movie. So the world didn't know what the opportunity was in Marvel movies, you know, outside of a Blade film and any other sort of one-off things that had happened previously. And Marvel was just, you know, Marvel was struggling. It's all public, it's all well known from a financial standpoint. And, you know, our advances and our guarantees, because of the opportunity of the video game, were pretty sizable. And then the royalties beyond that were even more sizable. So they were very excited.
And you were the guy who helped put it all together too.
Yes, that's correct. And ultimately, my not for a few years until later on, but ultimately I was Marvel's video game consultant for a while too, which put me in the unique position of telling them that they could get more money than they had gotten from me in the first place.
Oh, there you go. Fast forward a little bit to IDW.
Sure.
CEO, president, publisher.
Right.
When you get that role, if you had, or what were your top priorities as soon as you got the role? What are things that you wanted to instill in the company?
So I had known IDW's founder, Ted Adams, since IDW was founded in the late 90s. And I had known Ted prior to that, actually. I've known him pretty much since he's been in the industry. But I had told Ted, I felt that IDW was on the cusp of kind of breaking out into a place where they could be a top tier publisher. And he and his original partners and the people that worked there, they had done a lot of the heavy lifting. But I basically said to him, I said, look, my feeling is, you know, there's different stairs and different heights you have to achieve. And I think I can help you to sort of get to the next height based on my relationships and based on, you know, my abilities and interests. And so the priority was, Transformers had already been a huge hit for the company when I got there. Star Trek had been a hit, maybe not to the same degree, but big enough hit. But there weren't enough titles to keep that going. And if you're in the business of doing licensed comics, and IDW was doing both. IDW was doing self-created books like 30 Days and Lock and Key. I think Lock and Key #1 comes out right around, like, literally the time I joined the company. And then the licensed books, which represented an opportunity that kind of the big two had sort of, if not given up entirely, were just sort of, you know, Marvel and DC weren't really doing much. that business was Dark Horse and some other companies, and it felt like an opportunity. But Ted realized, and I realized, it can't be just about Transformers and Star Trek and a handful. I think we had some of this. We had a couple of like CBS shows like CSI and maybe one or two other things, but we needed really to break out. So my priority was sort of making a list of the possibilities. What are the titles with our competitors? What are the titles that have been successful with our competitors, and what are the ones that haven't been or could be potentially successful with us, and really expanding that. The other priority, I probably had a lot of them, but this is the one that jumps into mind. The other priority is that IDW was very focused on quality in terms of particularly we had good relationships with printers and an excellent production team, and had dabbled a little bit in archive projects before I got there. But I saw that as I just saw that as a huge opportunity, because for what was happening in the print industry was the cost effectiveness was coming to a place where you could make a high quality archive project and still make it, for lack of a better phrase, at a consumer friendly price.
Right.
This is as a guy that did a bunch of books that cost $100 or more. I'm not sure that qualifies as consumer friendly or not, especially if you buy a lot of them. But the same books that we did for $30, $50, $100, 5 years before that probably would have had to be twice as much. We print, thanks to new technology, a lot of new digital technology, and a lot of competition coming from the Far East in terms of China and Korea and what have you. We were able to get a high level of quality at a reasonable cost. So I saw an opportunity in archives, and we expanded Library of American Comics. We added Yo books. We launched the artist editions. Again, Scott Dunbier had the idea internally to kind of dabble with these things, but we had to make it financially. We're going to be able to figure out a way to not charge $500 a book for it.
Yeah, that might put some people off.
A few, yeah, a few. It actually I don't hear as many now that there are probably 80 or 85 of these out there. I don't hear as much about the price as I do about the size and weight of them.
Oh, okay.
I'm still hoping for the greatest cross promotion of all time, an IKEA artist edition bookcase.
Nice. That's not bad.
I actually have customized. They're not in they're not in my office here, but I actually have customized some to make them work. But I did it by cheating a little bit. So
hey, it gets the job done.
yeah.
You mentioned it before with Topps. You just mentioned it here with IDW, but the importance of getting into the licensed books world. I know Jim Shooter did it with Marvel at the time in the 70s and 80s, and helped them out a lot. Did you feel that the licensed books would hook a customer first, and then they could see, oh, if they put out this book, maybe I'll check out some other books they did? Or was it totally different? It's just a different fan base.
No, I think that's very astute. I don't know, we don't spend a lot of money in comics on market research per se. Matter of fact, in my video game days, we asked probably more questions about comic books than I think the comic book publishers have asked of research groups and focus groups and what have you. But yes, you do, if you're doing a quality job with Transformers and a quality job with Star Trek, and then we added Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Doctor Who and X-Files and some other things, and people see that, theoretically there'll be a subset of those people that will for the comic book stores that organize by company section, we'll go, oh, what's this title over here? What, look through that. Now, the flip side, again, IDW is unique in that, the company had only started publishing comic books in its history a few years after they launched, and my grammar's a little off on this, I apologize, but 30 Days of Night became such a breakout hit for an early series for a company to have that. So the company had already proven that they could create things, and then, shortly thereafter, Lock and Key, which was another breakout. So, we looked at sort of fighting the battle on all fronts. It's just like, okay, the licensed comics create not only an opportunity at the comic book store level, but they create promotional opportunities. They just, there was a period where we sold a ton of Transformers promotional comics to one or maybe two of the big box retailers. And that's just an opportunity to generate cash. It's why you mentioned Shooter. Back in those days, Marvel had a custom comics division doing nothing but those kinds of things, even treating their own characters like licensed characters and kind of creating promotional opportunities around them.
Yeah, most definitely.
So and there's still a little bit of that today. I want to say, I think it was at Baltimore Comic Con. I was chatting with my pal Sean Chen, and I think Sean had been working on something recently or in recent years that was like a Black Panther licensed comic that nobody outside of whoever got a copy of that comic had ever seen. Wow. Fun and sad, because I think being into the archive things, I think everything should be collected.
Yeah, no,
it's not economical, but there are just to this day, there's just, every publisher has something that's just never been collected. And I sit there and go, darn, I wish it was.
No, because it would open, you don't know what, opportunities it could open for new readers to see this.
Right.
And maybe you can expand on that character or go from there. And, like you said, it could be something very profitable.
It is, speaking as a publisher, it is impossible to keep everything in print. That I will say. We did our best. But as the library expanded, it just, you get to the point where you're just, you're like, okay, what are our top 50? What are our top 100? What are our top 500? Well, once you're at 500, you're like, wait a minute, we've got a lot of material here. How can we, and of course, things like, I mentioned artist editions, but even some of the bigger Library of American Comics, the strip reprint books are, just they're cost prohibitive to go back and print a few hundred copies.
Wondering, on a personal thing, you went from running a comics shop to being CEO of a very popular comics company. Did that ever hit you? Like, look at where I am now from, as a kid to where you were at that point?
Yeah, the whole, sometimes I look around my office and I see original art of things that I collected as a kid and original art of books that we published at Topps and original art of books that we published at IDW, and I look around and I go, it's like a Talking Head song. How did I get here? you might ask yourself, yes. And so the answer to your question is yes. When you look at my resume or my LinkedIn, it looks like the dots connect. You go, oh yeah, that. But when I think about it in my head, I'm like, okay, that's really interesting how this sort of, it sort of all went down.
Yes.
And it is odd to me that I can't remember what I ate for lunch yesterday, but I can remember the first time I might have met, Jack Kirby at a show when I was a kid, and then the opportunity to work with Jack to have the opportunity to work with Jack and Stan as a professional is just sort of, yes, every once in a while I do, if not physically pinch myself, I mentally pinch myself. That's crazy. I mean, we published a book of Holocaust related comics with Neil Adams. And it's just like, what? Like, I just, I there's a lot of projects like that I just sit there and I do. And I've now lost the rest of the day after our recording's over, because I'll be like thinking about all these different things. Well, oddly, I mean, look here, the perfect example. I have, I've been around a while, as we've obviously determined, talking about some of these things, but I published a fanzine in the 70s called Comic Chronologue. Every once in a while, a copy of number 1 will pop up on eBay. I've never seen the later issue. Well, 3 technically nobody would ever see, but 2 I've never seen a copy of, which is a shame because I lost mine along the way. But the point is that Paul Levitz, one of the things that he did in fandom, besides being editor and publisher of the Comics Reader before he went to work for DC, was he ran a fanzine table at Phil Seuling's conventions. And so basically, I think we probably had a 50-50 split with Phil. I don't remember, but Paul was in charge of all these selling fanzines at this con, and you worked out your deal with. And I think about that. Here's a guy that ultimately became the not only the publisher of DC, but a very well-known and important publisher of DC. And I was like, this guy used to sell my crappy little fanzine at the booth.
Hey, it shows anything can happen. You work hard enough, and
You just can't. You really would be. We'd all be sitting on yachts or doing something like that if we could figure out this is the way it's going to go down. It just doesn't. It's just odd.
No, 100%. A couple more IDW questions for you. One was with Top Shelf. When you acquired them, what was it about them that you felt was be a good fit with IDW?
It's a great question. And I think that the number one thing was that we had not had yet a track record in doing the kinds of indie graphic novels that Top Shelf was doing. I mean, literally, it was probably the major missing link in our publishing program. We just didn't have a track record. We probably had done, I mean, not probably, I know we had done some, but we really certainly didn't have major relationships in the indie market, and really didn't have necessarily anyone on our staff editorially who really had a good feel for those kinds of things. And we knew it was an opportunity from the standpoint of, if we don't figure out a way to get into that market, we're going to get left behind. And I think, we were looking to grow through acquisition at that point, because again, getting back to licensed comics, there are only so many licenses that you can have. There are, at some point, at one point, we had a good chunk of the ones that were available, considering that certain companies had proprietary relationships, and those properties weren't going anywhere. So we were like, okay, we've got, new properties will come along and be successful, and you'll want to do a licensed comic based on that. But to grow the business, it has to be vertically and horizontally. And so we actually spent more than a year looking around and kicking the tires at potential companies. And just Top Shelf was a great fit, and Chris Staros is such a terrific editor. Just one of the just talk about something that people don't talk about enough. Chris has got an eye for talent like very few people that I've seen. Really, just tremendous, and just really, his hits versus misses ratio is really high. In a business where you just never know how the market's going to react to these things.
Right.
So,
and sort of tied into that is, these days the independent world is changing a lot because of Kickstarter, because of backed comic books that folks can put out. If you were in a company right now, or when you were at IDW or something, what are aspects in a comic that you looked for that said, okay, this has potential, as opposed to maybe not this time?
It's a really tough question. And a lot of it is really a matter of timing. It gets back to our kind of comment about the Kirbyverse and some other things. A lot of it is, what genres or what styles become popular for a while. And are you getting something that has a, you can look at it from a number of different angles. You can go, okay, this style, maybe everybody's doing noir comics, fans are buying noir comics, and it makes sense to get some good talent and do a noir comic. The flip side of that is nobody's doing fill in the blank. Nobody's doing a Western horror book right now, right? So we did Tim Truman's Hawking. Well, nobody else was doing I think Jonah Hex, I can't remember if DC was still doing Jonah Hex at the time that we did Hawking or not. So maybe there was one other Western horror at the same time. But it's a perspective of going, okay, this blank feels popular, we can do more of it, or this looks completely unlike something else out there. Let's give this a try. And it's just, good editorial talent just develops a feel for that. I was talking about Star Us, and certainly IDW is fortunate enough to have plenty of editorial talent over the years, to kind of look at that and say, wow, that's that seems like a good fit for where the marketplace is heading. What's the famous Wayne Gretzky quote, right? You don't want to be where the puck is, you want to be where it's going to be. Right. And a lot of times you're trying, you certainly don't want to you don't want to be a trend follower, because by the time you actually get the creative team and put it on a book and get the book out the door, the world may have moved on. So you kind of want, you certainly want to try and anticipate trends and the like.
And sort of based on that, I think you're the perfect guy to ask this, is that, and you saw it from, your job, but the MCU, the DCU, TV shows, it seems like anyone loves talking about comic books. When it comes to movies, when it comes to TV shows, independent comics are being picked up by Netflix and some of the streaming services. Mm-hmm. How does the industry get those people to then pivot them to the comic books to say, hey, you liked all of this, but guess what? This is where it started. There's stories here that you could check out too.
I think that's $1 million question, and I think we've all been struggling with it as an industry. Certainly at a minimum for 20 years. That's a long time, right? So going back to, we're talking about the first X-Men movie. This is now fall of 2022, which means the Spider-Man movie is now 20 years. The first Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire movie, is now 20 years old. How did that happen? We've clearly established that audiences love these characters. They love the stories when they're good, and they love the action. And maybe it's just that the experience of watching it on the big screen, or even, renting it later on and watching it on a large screen TV, is, to a civilian audience, for lack of a better word, I'm sure I'm not the only guest to ever use that phrase, to a civilian audience, maybe the comic books just don't replicate that experience, right? It's just, first of all, you start by taking away sound. Well, if George Lucas is right, sound is 50% of the movie experience. So you've taken away a chunk, and you're reading, but you're not reading because you're looking at this visual storytelling. And so maybe it's just, at the end of the day, people talk about the language of comic books, and you either have a feel for that language or you don't. And it doesn't matter whether you love the movie, you're just not, you're going over to something that's in a different language, and you're not quite making the pass. I will say, a story that I don't think is talked about enough is that I believe the movies, particularly not only the big MCU and DC movies, but also when people find out that, History of Violence came from a comic book, or Ghost World came from a comic book, or what I think that's done is, I think comic books and graphic novels are now a fully acceptable medium. And I think that if we haven't sold more Spider-Man comics than the Spider-Man movie, that is a shame. But if we have said, if we have said to parents and educators and other people that this is a perfectly great medium to be included, it's then to some degree mission accomplished. That really feels like, because honestly, I struggle with it all the time. Let's get more Transformers, movie fans and toy fans into the comics. And there are these little, I'm sure everybody sees it, there are these little bursts, Batman and Spider-Man and Transformers and X-Men and so on and so forth, but they don't last. But again, if you go back, you were talking about Greg the fan versus Greg the professional. You go back to when I was a kid, you didn't necessarily tout the fact that you were into comic books. I didn't keep it a dark secret. It wasn't like, but I also, I was much more likely to talk to my friends about baseball and other sports and other things. It just was a niche it was a niche hobby. And now, even if the niche hasn't grown substantially, or maybe, maybe even if there are actually less total readers, the idea that you can have, that it's an acceptable medium, it is a place for storytelling. And the other thing that's happened, I think, and I do believe the mass media has made this possible, is the fact that now there are comics for just all audiences, right? I mean, again, going back to when I was a kid, were there really comic books for women or people of color? Not, every once in a while something would come along, but the biggest story in Supergirl was what costume was she going to be wearing that month? I mean, it really wasn't like, or kids sending in their fashion tips to Millie the Model or something other, Katie Keener or what have you. So it's just like the world's changed, and I think the fact that we constantly see these characters in the mass media has helped that change.
One more question for you, and it's sort of a change in the industry now where artists and writers, people really don't have long runs on books like years ago, when you'd have Kirby on the long run, or McFarlane long run with Spider-Man. They like to do a handful of issues or maybe one arc, then jump somewhere else, do another book. For you as a publisher, did you mind that, or would you rather have had someone that you knew every month, I'm going to get this art or this story, and I can depend on that?
I guess this is almost a question of personal taste. And so I think from a personal taste standpoint, I like the continuity. I like what we built up with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, where we knew that Kevin Eastman and Tom Waltz were going to be involved in some way. We might change, art teams, or we might change part of the art team from time to time, but we had that continuity. And I think we laid the groundwork. Turtles has been at IDW now 12 years, give or take. And, we laid the groundwork for that, for the fans feeling comfortable that there was not going to be a giant change in direction. We weren't going to reboot, Leonardo 3 times. We weren't going to, of course, you always want to keep it fresh. You always want to keep it new. But at the same time, the foundation, nobody was coming and ripping out the foundation. And so, again, I'm answering personal taste. I prefer some sort of continuity. I do believe that continuity lays the basis for commercial success. I think constant reboots, the idea that we have to constantly put number ones into comic book stores to get people interested, or it's frustrating. And a lot of times those numbers, there's a period where you go, well, maybe we can fully, we'll keep the creative team, but we'll just relaunch with the number one. You're like, okay, you're not fooling anyone with that. And then to your point, you're like, okay, let's go in a completely different. So I invested 3 years. I'm at issue 36, and now you're going in a completely different direction. And no, that's not for me editorially. I still think, despite the fact that Spider-Man gets most of the acclaim from sort of the Marvel Silver Age, those 100 issues by Lee and Kirby of Fantastic Four are the most important 100-issue run, particularly the middle peak of it, right? Like the late 30s to the early mid 70s, issue numbering, obviously not the idea that you could build, and the idea that you could they had to keep track of continuity, something that no one had ever been worried about in comics before. And these endless conversations about, well, did we do it, or did Kirby do it, okay, great. But they sat there and they said, okay, if this happened in issue 48 and we're going to make a change in 72, we're going to explain editorially, what we're doing here. Did they do it 100%? No, I'm sure there are some veterans of fandom that could point out the places where they didn't. But the idea was that they were trying to stay on top of that. And they told, Fantastic. 1 through 100, and everybody should reread those. And if you haven't, if there are people listening who haven't read them, they absolutely should read them. It's just, it's taking the soap opera format from this, the old daily soap opera TV shows and applying it to, great superhero narrative stories. I mean, just,
It's why they're the classic.
And again, it's funny, I said Spider-Man, but there's a perfect example. Romita's, when Romita got cooking, a year after he took over, maybe even less, it's a different Spider-Man than Ditko Spider-Man. And look, it happened to be the one, it's confusing for me as a kid because I'm buying the Romitas off the newsstands, but I'm also buying Marvel Tales, which is reprinting the Ditko Spider-Mans. And I'm like, huh? But they're equally, not for everyone, they're equally likable to me. They're different, but they're likable. But that 100 issues, which translates to about 8 years, I think, 62 to 70, so 8 years. Astonishing. I would love to see, there's been a few since, I know Todd's been involved with Spawn from day one. Eric Larson is on, I've lost track of what issue of Savage Dragon, there's been, that continuity becomes meaningful over a long period of time. It really does.
Agree 100%. What's coming up for you? What are some new projects you're working on?
Well, it's interesting. So since my tenure at IDW has been over, which sort of I was under contract with them until shortly before the pandemic began. I've been just doing some quiet consulting, primarily for creators, which I really enjoy doing. Creators are not good often with economics. I hate to generalize, but so I did early in the pandemic, I did a hero initiative thing called Comicsnomics, which is just sort of talking a little bit about some of the thing. And I got some decent feedback after that. And I have plenty of friends who are creators. I like the creative side of the business. One of the reasons I don't think I would enjoy being publisher / president of a big company again is the fact that my days were 10 hours of emails and meetings, and you're like, wait a minute, wasn't I doing this because it's fun at some point? Like, you lose some of that, right? So I've been helping some, again, creators are often presented with terms or contracts from publishers that have a take it or leave it quality to them, or at least in the creator's minds. And the reality is, in most cases, and you should be trying to work with people who at least have some flexibility in thinking, in most cases, they're not really take it or leave it. They're just, the creator doesn't know what they even should be negotiating. So I've been able to help a few people, just again, doing it, doing it here and there. I actually did see, considering I've been working in this industry a really long time, I actually did see the worst contract I've ever seen in this past year. That was very exciting. I posted about it. I didn't go into the details because I didn't want to implicate the guilty party, but it was really awful. I was like, okay. There are a few cases where I've had to beg the clients, please don't sign what you've been given, but they're really anxious to do a project. The latest thing is, somebody was working on an NFT related project, and they were being told they were going to be paid in Bitcoin. And I was just like, no, you don't understand. That means, let's say your rate is $400 a page. If Bitcoin goes down 75% before you turn in your final, then your rate is down to $100 a page. Do you really want to work from? Neither of those numbers are, they're meant to be illustrative. They're not meant to be numbers. But yeah, I just, so that's been fun. I've done a couple of publishing consulting projects. I do have a couple of books that have been on the back burner. There's one that's starting to move to the front burner with a well-known creator who's passed away a bunch of years ago, and it's with his estate that we'd be working with, and a few other things like that. But I'm a late career professional, as they say. So I've been enjoying the less of the grind.
That's awesome. And
I also, I do some lot. I mean, again, I'm still very involved in the original art circles. Now that conventions are starting to come back to normal a little bit, I've gone to a few conventions. I'm trying to build a library of photos of creators. So at conventions, I'm taking a ton of pictures. At Baltimore Comic Con, my photos are on there, the con's Facebook page. And I blog about talking about comic art. I do have an art blog where I talk about some of the pieces I own and why I like them or why they're meaningful to me.
Hey, welcome back. So, again, I'm kicking myself. I couldn't be on this interview. I could have talked for hours about IDW's titles. They're great. They have all the cool titles, that stuff that we've grown up with that are not Marvel and DC. And, it's clear that he is a collector as well. You could see a lot of the cool art behind him, as well as, comic books and just collecting cool stuff. So, Oren, another home run, just another notch in the Oren only belt.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. And Greg said he would love to come back on. So you have the time to talk to him and wax poetic all about IDW. He's a great guy. And he made a really interesting point that you putting together a company, you need those licensed books to sort of not offset, but to mix in with original titles to get more eyes on what you're putting out there. And that's a really, it's a concept that makes sense, but it's one I hadn't thought of before. So, Greg, thank you so much for taking the time. We'd love to have you back. Like I said, really, 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 really nice guy for someone that powerful in the comic world. So we hope you enjoyed it. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Rate, review, subscribe, and we will see you next time.